Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this wonderful talk. This talk is organized by the Feminist Thinking Seminar Series by the Intersectional Humanities Research Hub and the African Languages, Literatures and Culture Storage Network. So this is a collaborative and wonderful talk that is going to be led by the wonderful Osman. She is a scholar that also did the master's here in Oxford in women's gender and sexuality in 2018. And she is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, Center for Multidisciplinarity, Gender, and a Gates Scholar. Her doctoral research is basically mapping the continuities between transatlantic slavery and its attendant racial logics, and their relation to the role ethnicity played in the Liberian Civil War. She completed her master's, like I said, here in the University of Oxford, and she also was a Clarendon scholar. And she also is a co-founder of and facilitator of the Race Talk Seminar series, based in the University of Cambridge and the Center for Gender Studies. And well, please welcome Ola.
So thank you for having me, first of all. Specifically Boulanger, thank you for inviting me back again. So I'll just get right into it. If at any point you need me to slow down or I start talking too fast, just wave. Yeah, so I'll just start reading. Okay, so post-colonial conflicts in Africa have been persistently represented as an example of wanton violence, ethnocentrism, political tribalism, chaos, or an amalgamation of such elements without any due attention to their historical context. Though, since the end of the Cold War, a burgeoning body of international relations literature has affirmed and indexed European imperialism, particularly the colonial era divide and rule, modi operandi, as a pivotal aspect in the production of colonial difference in the proliferation of organized ethno-nationalist violence and political unrest in Africa. And while it is recognized that the profits generated from transatlantic slavery were used for sponsoring Western European expansionism and the development of industrial capitalist societies, the catastrophic bearing of racial slavery on the socio-political topography of West Central Africa and its still unfolding reverberations has not been fully reckoned with. Certainly, it is imperative to consider how the specter of the plantation economy is a constitutive aspect in the genealogy of modern forms of African governance, sovereignty, sociality, and by sociality, I mean freedom, subjection, and insurrection. The transatlantic slave trade transcended its expose as a mere incongruous economic phenomenon. As David Eltis polemically reminds us, Western Europe, specifically England, was densely overpopulated during the time of slavery, suggesting, and provocatively so, that had Europeans enslaved other Europeans, such as war prisoners, convicts, vagrants, Irish, Scots, etc., as was routine in human history, labor demands would have been fulfilled at a considerably lower financial and human cost. The kidnapping of 12 million people from the continent of Africa, in contrast, constituted an act of genocide. The existential telos of the plantation laid not in a simple cost reduction and profit maximization economic calculation, although Black labor power was paramount to the development of the world economy and the accumulation of capital by Western Europe's ruling and mercantile classes. Rather, it was in the formation of a universalized symbolic syntax of ontological racial difference. This involved the deliberate invention of a nominal Blackness, and by extension, the formulation of a nominal whiteness, or more broadly, a structural non-Blackness. Within this framework, the peculiar institution of racial slavery would be singularly tethered to the Black and African. Definitively then, slavery is and connotes an ontological status for Blackness, and therefore the constituent elements of slavery are not exploitation and alienation, but accumulation and fungibility. Racialization is a means of displacing what is with something else, with another reality. This modern matrix of race is simulacra, blackness is simulacra. How are we doing? Yeah. Against this discursive scene, this research raises questions about why, in the field of international relations, the transatlantic slave economy and post-colonial rebel movements in Africa have been conventionally treated as discrete phenomena. Surely, if war is a continuation, politics by other means, and politics is definitively a refraction between the concept of the individuated subject, the nation, and by extension, the globe, we should consider how the vestiges of colonialism and racial slavery persistently haunt systems, drive ideologies held by political actors, orchestrate their maneuvers, and shadow our methods for studying and analyzing modern warfare and international relations at large. Such a consideration might unearth new insights from well-trodden discursive terrains. Articulated in my work is an epistemic intervention into discussions about Africa's unending wars as a puzzle for political thought. Echoing Robert Vitalis, white supremacy and/or anti-Blackness functioned as the most significant American cultural export of the 20th century, molding in its own image the development and contours of racism in the subaltern regions of the world. It remains disconcerting then that IR theory has yet to adequately account for the materialization of US plantation racism beyond its own national borders. Within the specific context of the geopolitical South, Liberia emerges as a poignant locus for studying what Catherine McKittrick articulates as the migratory nature of plantation logics. Given its distinct history as a settlement for emancipated diasporic Africans, rethinking Liberia's history in this way affords scholars an opportunity to grapple with the systemic sequela of the slave trade on continental African communities. While there exists an extensive body of literature interrogating the impact of slavery on the African continent, providing insights into demographic shifts and community-led political impacts ascending from the trade, a systematic analysis of race and racialization doesn't. Such theoretical failings persist with few exceptions, as Jemima Pierre reminds us. So, thinking with and through the Black radical tradition, specifically its critical meditations on liberal humanism, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and unfreedom in the afterlife of slavery, I aim to show how the invention of racial Blackness not only constitutes the infrastructural foundation of the prevailing global capitalist order, but choreographs the epistemic core of IR's hegemonic theoretical approaches, which are habitually expended to make sense of global political economy, state formation, ethnic nationalisms, domestic and international conflicts, and security. For elucidatory purposes, consider that the devastation of the Holocaust in Europe during World War II augmented some fundamental concepts of international human rights law and crimes against humanity. Conversely, the concentration camps or death camps of Nazi Germany are historically contiguous with different forms of colonialism and genocide. That is to say, modern concentration camps find their conceptual pedigrees in the Indian removal camps of the 1830s, originally devised to detain 22,000 Cherokee. Nazi state death camps are also contiguous with the occurrence of the Atlantic crossing that ensued through the door of no return, in the words of Dion Brand, the door out of which Africans were captured, loaded onto ships heading for the New World. The disembodied souls of those who did not survive the Middle Passage, also known as the MAFA or the African Holocaust, endured. Those Africans thrown, jumped, dumped overboard, their atoms remain dispersed in the ocean even today. These are the spirits of the lost ancestors whom Ghanaians mourn each year at sea while they mark the Mafa on their side of the Atlantic. Withal, concentration camps are inextricably linked to the contraband camps that were established in the post-war period ensuing the American Civil War, designed to imprison fugitive slaves fugitive slaves as outlawed cargo or enemy property. These cases are elucidated merely to map the historical continuity of the state of exception. Of course, the examples of exorbitant violence in modern human history are many. For example, Palestine right now, South Africa, in any case, are the enumerated examples above not commensurate with the magnitude of violence that would constitute the absolutely catastrophic? Did not the historical manifestations of such terrible brutality demand not only humanitarian action, but a moralistic repudiation of the injustice that permitted such pervasive terror and suffering to unfold in the first place? In posing this question, my intention is not necessarily to render extra exceptional the conditions of Black or Indigenous life in modernity, but rather to gesture to an ethical, political, and epistemic dilemma concerning the frames, and drawing on Butler here, so gender studies, frames through which we apprehend or indeed fail to apprehend the lives of others as lost or injured. I echo Christina Sharp's apt observation that the Holocaust is available as a human tragedy in a way that slavery, revolution, and their afterlives are not. As I write this, I'm reminded that Black African students in Ukraine were blocked from crossing European borders following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The European Union's sponsoring of migrant prisons, specifically designed to incarcerate asylum seekers of African descent, sharply contrasts with the swift and urgent humanitarian aid extended to white Ukrainians. Even the US has proffered asylum to white Ukrainians, juxtaposed with the concurrent risk of deportation faced by Haitian and Cameroonian asylum seekers. Blackened people are imagined as the carriers of terror, that is to say, as a security threat, rather than bodies seeking refuge from the incessant terrors of war, systematic violence, and persecution. So I endeavor to grapple with the central epistemic difficulty of how a nominal we study African wars by way of using the Liberian predicament as a case for contemplation. I utilize, so the term predicament is from the Latin predicare, meaning state of being or condition. I utilize this hermeneutical approach to think about the Liberian Civil War, examining its circumstances as a historicity of social relations wrought by the phenomenon of American racial slavery. The term predicament is intended to encapsulate Liberia's complicated situation, acknowledging that its problematic circumstances predated the outbreak of militarized spectacular violence made spectacle in 1989. Generally, I'm hostile to the crude and moralistic accounts about how Black countries come to be militarized, precisely because such accounts are often predicated on the forgetting of the life that surrounds scenes of extreme violence and sedition. I orient my attention toward the matrix of political and social relations among different groups in early Liberia, particularly around 1822, to emphasize the simultaneous occurrences of the inauguration of the transatlantic slave trade and militarization along the west coast of Africa. So these are the key questions that I'm trying to contend with. How did ethnicity become a central organizing feature of Liberian social, political, and economic life? What limitations arise from adopting IR's circular approaches to generally understanding and ending African wars, broadly speaking? What are the assumptive anti-Black logics that underwrite IR's most basic theoretical claims about the nature of warfare in sub-Saharan Africa? And how can the theoretical protocols of Black studies help us to make bare such presuppositions? Certainly, it is now generally accepted by scholars that international relations emerged to provide intellectual support for the imperial settler colonial ambitions of Western states. I build on this work from the vantage point of Black studies, and particularly Afro-pessimism, to show that not only are the onto-epistemic premises of our social and political inquiries fundamentally anti-Black, or even that structural racism is constitutive to social contract theory, but also scholars have conventionally believed to be internal ethnic divisions and fragmentations in post-colonial African societies should instead be explicated as a manifestation of transnational anti-Black violence. So a little bit about the Liberian Civil War for those who aren't familiar. So Liberia's Truth and Reconciliation Commission found that constitutive to the eruption of the first civil conflict in 1980 is that the country was part of the problem was the organization of Liberia as an apartheid state due to the historical segregation of indigenous Africans who are referred to as natives and Americo-Liberians who are referred to as settlers. And the utilization of violent means to fortify and consolidate Americo-Liberian political and economic power for over a century. The tensions that such divisions engendered helped establish the groundwork for the deadly rice riots of 1979 and the subsequent coup d'etat staged by military leader Samuel Doe, which brought the sitting president William Tolbert's Americo-Liberian inclined regime to an end in 1980. At first, the Doe administration declared an uncompromising commitment to the formation of a cohesive Black national identity in Liberia and disavowed any divisions of the nation along ethnic lines. However, and not surprisingly, rather than overturning the legacy of ethno-nationalist race-based systems of political patronage maintained by all the preceding regimes, Doe conceded economic and educational privileges for the ethnic groups to which he belonged, which was the Kran group specifically. And to further fortify and entrench his own political power, he installed Kran people in the most politically dominant seats. Such nepotistic arrangement only exacerbated existing ethno-racial tensions and other complicated grievances concerning the unequal distribution of power and resources nationally. All grievances, which had been hitherto subdued under Americo-Liberian hegemony. So Liberia's second war started, and so the first war starts in 79, second war starts in 89, and it ends in 2003, killing approximately 250,000 Liberians and internally displacing half of the population. The precise onset of the Second Civil War was Christmas Eve of 1989, when the National Patriotic Front, under the leadership of Charles Taylor, launched a military incursion into Nimba County, infiltrating from Liberia's common border with Cote d'Ivoire. Samuel Doe, the sitting president, launched a counterinsurgency campaign, which dispatched corps from the AFL, which is the Armed Forces of Liberia, predominantly made up of soldiers. The AFL would specifically target members of the Geo and Mano ethnic groups under the idea that they were adversaries of the Doe administration. Though the antagonism that typified interactions between the Kran, Mano, and Geo groups had preceded this fighting. However, it is not the tautological continuation of structural violence by way of the Doe regime that I'm concerned with. Rather, it is the liminal space, that racialized enclosure from which one seizes the opportunity to exercise power over others. What openings might surface if we probe into this notion of power, not as an object to be held, but a structural orientation in a global context in which imbibing the mystifications of the ruling class becomes a strategy of survival, bracketing the problematics of being motivated by greed. In this way, we can regard the state as a modern matrix of individualization, or a threadful womb that envelops the flesh and gestates the universal individuated human body subject. Americo-Liberians were inculturated into the vagaries of a slave system and its caste-based social structure. And by way of internalizing these norms, they committed to reproducing in plantocracy in Liberia. In such a context, the contest for political power between varying social groups has become a way of life. But otherwise, vying for authority transforms into a way of being, a mundane disposition, a habituation of sorts. Ethno-nationalism is always operating within the folds of a gratuitous anti-Black world-making scheme where the maneuvers of corporate, state, individual and institutional bodies are sometimes beyond the self-possessed will of the living. The tension between the existing literature and what I am bringing to account resides partly in a feminist approach to agency. I'm suggesting that totally implicating Liberian people in their predicament simply encourages a militaristic and melodramatic view of agency and the spectacular temporality of the event of the decision, and in linking and inflating consciousness. Intention in decision or event, it has provided an alibi for normative governmentality and justified moralizing against inconvenient human activity. So that's Lauren Berlant's work. So put another way, we depress how power surveils, controls, and orders bodies in favor of a moral evaluation of the individuated subject. I'm also thinking alongside Michel Foucault's theorization of the panopticon, which he describes as an architectural apparatus that functions as a machine for creating and sustaining power independent of the person who exercises. This can perhaps be understood as an incarceration of the psyche, referring to the individuated subject's embodied habituation or self-surveillance. It constitutes a mode of control or governmentality that extends beyond the concrete management of bodies that cannot be adequately encapsulated by the concepts of direct or indirect colonial rule, as it depends on the interpolation of a certain society's normative values. Part of what we're struggling against and can perhaps best be described as a paradox of self-deception. White supremacy provides a subtext for this relation with oneself. How are we doing for time? Yeah. So ultimately, this work looks at how anti-Blackness functions as a kind of absent presence that composes and propels the epistemological and ontological orderings of space and subjectivity, and examines the historical evidence that it always already permeates Liberian people's social and self-consciousness, as well as their political imaginations. Along these lines, it is my contention that the case of Liberia conspicuously demonstrates that anti-Blackness is an ether, as an ontological atmosphere, has a built-in capacity to maintain itself, such that the violent force of white supremacy self-extends the colonized and stolen people's interpolation of its ideologies. So Sailor James reminds us historians wrote so well because they saw so little. Extant explanations falter in their failure to heed to the history of a complicated and volatile West African political history circa the 1600s to the 1900s. It's difficult to fully grasp Liberia's descent into violent conflict without attending to the institution of racial slavery in the circum-Atlantic world, the scramble for Africa and European colonial incursions into Liberia, Reconstruction in America from 1863 to 1877, the rise of Black/African nationalisms, and Liberia's standing in the international sphere as the second independent Black republic in the world after Haiti. Moreover, the enormous bearing the ACS, so the American Colonization Society, had on Liberia cannot be adequately represented without proper regard being given to the plantation logics that animated the social, political, and economic and theological worldviews of the society's founders themselves. Members of the planter oligarchy. Indeed, many founders of the ACS are generally known as America's founding fathers. So here again, I'm thinking with Catherine McKittrick's theorization of the plantation as a space of racial surveillance and anti-Black violence, sexual cruelty, and economic accumulation. In my estimation, and as I demonstrate in my work, anti-Black violence and exclusion have not always only been normative to the idea of the state and international politics, but constitutive aspects of Liberian social, cultural, and political life, along with the establishment of the republic. So I echo Jared Sexton's appeal that politics is something that we ought to strain against as it strains against us. Unambiguously then, I am writing against Hannah Arendt's concept of politics, which posits that violence occurs solely at the point of an imbalance between public law and political fact. This idea is further elaborated by distinguishing between power and force or violence, a discussion that securitization theory reproduces by theoretically severing okay, so severing politicization from securitization. So Ham's concept of the political finds its roots in racist German anthropology that distinguished between uncivilized quote unquote nature people and civilized cultured people. This mode of modern signification delineates communities based on criteria such as historical background, language, and the strength of their political institutions. It definitively distinguishes between those possessing such attributes from those without. So this discourse espouses the moral and political superiority of the settler while cautioning against a perceived primitivism of the native and the other. This explicitly suggests that racialized communities along the commons besiege ideals of political freedom and democracy. It follows then that politics is an ongoing attack on the commons, the general and generative antagonism from within the surround. Ultimately, it is my contention that a revision of Liberian historiography is integral to mapping the transposing relations of domination between African and African descended people, and to developing an analytic that describes the antagonisms that structure Black/African intersubjective relations at large, and more specifically, how the interanimations between African and European philosophies of being radically bewitched Liberian ontologies. Writ large, the sociocultural and political history that I'm endeavoring to recount is one of conflict through violence and about violent conditions, and about the violent conditions that imposed Black life in coastal West Africa during the Victorian era. So things do not improve over time, despite Dr. Martin Luther King's prophetic enunciation that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Hegel's philosophy of history, as elaborated in his lectures, posits that history unfolds as a continuous movement towards human freedom. While freedom may not be fully actualized, Hegel assures us of its imminent realization, proclaiming that the progressive accumulation of time inevitably leads to improvement of societal conditions, and that subjectivity is always becoming, since it involves persistent movement with historical time. Conversely, this notion that the trajectory of history instinctively moves towards racial vindication is no more than a humanist fantasy of resolution and movement. Rather, violence becomes more established and perfected with the accumulation of modern time. Therefore, this work disavows any teleological explication of crisis and contends with the simplicity of the structural and existential violence which continues to possess Black life in Liberia, or as Toni Morrison articulates it in Beloved, all of it is now, is always now. So likely as you progress through the country's history, you'll perceive conditions to be fixedly unendurable at a structural level. But, and most crucially here, it is my position that the Liberian predicament cannot be approached as one of political gains and mismanagement or a failure to modernize. Although such elaborations are not historically inaccurate, they must be taken with the fact that triumph was never meant to be a possibility for Black folks existing in the New World. To the critical eye, this reality is readily discernible at every juncture throughout Liberia's modern history and that of many post-colonial African societies. Part of what is necessary is the materialization of a comprehensive analytic that remarks on and spectacularizes those existential modes of violence that have been rendered cultural and therefore normative and unremarkable. By enacting the praxis of what Hartman calls defamiliarizing the familiar, we can place the Liberian predicament along a continuum of structural violence that is symptomatic of a larger racialized world-making project of imperial expansion sustained by anti-Black racism, all in all, my work maps how a theorization of anti-Blackness forges a way to clearly identify and respond to commonsensical racism in our theory and practice. By doing this, it places the discipline's cultural disregard and disgust with Blackness, as Michael Dumas puts it, at the center of the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Ola. It's really easy to find like a, quick question after that super,
Sorry,
super intense.
yeah.
I'll give you a couple of minutes and I'll come up with the first one. I'm kind of interested in Liberia, because I mean the demonstration and what we know about the history of Liberia, the weight of white supremacy is very clear in the ways in which it has created that kind of segregated society between American Liberians being Western or labeling themselves as Western and modern and therefore othering and dehumanizing the indigenous communities of Liberia. I wonder to what extent whiteness is something that is made explicit in Liberian society. So is there a discourse about whiteness? I guess what I'm interested in is what are the emic categories that are put forward? How is race changed in that sense? I mean, I'm thinking about Mandani's definition of ethnicity versus race, where ethnicity is various cultural groups and race is always pointing to someone who is not coming from there. And so I wonder to what extent that applies to Liberia and to what extent that is woven into an understanding of the Liberian elite or oligarchy as white.
Okay, there's a lot in there. So one, I want to start by addressing the way that we draw a distinction between ethnicity and race. So ethnicity as culture and race is problematic, right? Because we really actually cannot in modernity draw that distinction. We can't really trace culture in a way that doesn't have racialized roots, right? Because that culture does not travel away from colonial modernity. So I think the distinction itself is up for debate, especially because ethnicity doesn't actually become a word that's used until the 19th century or the early 20th century. And really what it does is it comes to replace race in the international sphere. So at some point, the international community is talking about or thinking about the world in racial terms. And then we get this moment where we're talking about the new imperialism. And with the new imperialism comes the invention of ethnicity. That really is just a misnomer for a racial problem. So that's the first part of the question. And then the second part is about how I think race is made really explicit in Liberia. And I think in 1820s, 1830s, maybe all the way up to 1860, people are using explicitly racialized language to one another. So indigenous Liberians refer to American Liberians as white men. And remember, this is an all Black context. Everybody's Black, everybody has Black skin. And American Liberians refer to indigenous people as bush niggers. So for me, the question is, okay, how does that happen unless we need to think about white supremacy beyond epidermalization, right? Does that speak to your question?
Yeah, a lot. I would potentially have a comeback on that, but I'd rather hear from other people's questions. Does anyone want to ask a question? Sure.
Hi. Can I just quickly write that down?
I love that. I can sing a little song while we wait. Elevator tune.
Yeah, so hi, so I'm in gender studies, so I'm a political theorist.
Okay, cool.
So maybe that's going to betray some kind of like horror tendencies.
No.
I thought it was a brilliant presentation, thank you so much. I just to push you on something a little. So you talk about, so I think about the way in which you go between, and because this is really key in what I do, around and international relations. And I want to push maybe on who their subjects are, because it seems to me that you're completely right in the kind of in the sort of broadly black ontological or like Afro-pessimist frame, they have a lot of critiques of who the people say the subject is and what that subject is, right? So that we are the non-subject, right, and that subsequently the human is this kind of suspect category altogether. And certainly that is kind of damning for Arendt, who sees politics as this basic creativity. But it's not. But I'm interested in like the difference between maybe political philosophers and international relations scholars, when they would say that actually like we're not interested in humans altogether. Like what? Like humans are interesting. Like this is not the subject of international relations, right? The subject of international relations are states, right? And the rules are realism, right? Is that actually humans have very little to do with it, right? And therein, maybe they actually have like weirdly a more similar view of time than we do, right? Because like a lot of international realists, they have no views that the world is getting better, right? Because they say effectively the world's been the same since ancient Greece. So I was just wondering, do you think there's a need to kind of to understand like the state system as kind of the anti-black figure that is maybe the subject of that, and that has like slightly different temporal implications as well. Sorry, that's a lot.
No, but I think that's an interesting question, because for me, I think that scholars of international relations, as much as they want to say, we're objective and all we care about is states and the relations to one another, at the same time they'll turn around and say, this particular African politician is really corrupt. And I'm like, I thought you were only interested in states, right? And I think I'm also speaking to liberal democracy, right? Because democracy doesn't come into being without slavery, right? And not only that, but slaves are not understood as part of that polity, right? Being 3/5 of human beings, right? But they're the reason that America is America, right? And they're the reason for democracy. So I guess on that front, I would say that that's what I mean when I say anti-Blackness is the bedrock on which the idea of the state and the good, proper functioning democracy comes out of, right? And then I just don't think there's no such thing as a system that doesn't operate based on people's ideologies, right? And people's interpolations of what depending on the context in the society, right? On what normative politics should look like, and not only what normative politics should look like, what the normative human should behave like under a particular state form or governmentality, right? So for me, and I think this is so central to just feminist theory in general, is there is no sort of objective realist truth that we can even really contend with here. Yeah, does that speak to?
Of course.
Yeah. Because I'm happy to keep having a conversation about it. If
No,
okay, good.
You can go back.
I feel that in a way you are describing something. You're not describing subjectivities. You are describing, let's call it a system. And that system could be described as differential positions or a binarity. In which binarity you got something that you could call symbolic whiteness and symbolic blackness. And onto that symbolic whiteness and symbolic blackness, you could map modern versus traditional, civilized versus, sort of backward and so on and so forth. And what I understand you to be saying is this is not a local problem. There is a transnational logic. How do you dislodge a differential system? How do you dislodge this binarity?
Yeah.
Obviously, by pointing it out, that's start
Yeah.
source. And I don't know, obviously, I don't know how acceptable that binarity would be in general, because so often it's seen as a local problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
So definitely you are saying this.
Yeah.
And I suppose there are implications for gender in this. I mean, we can see that sort of what you're saying is there is this transnational logic, which then is transferred.
Yeah.
And it was kind of transferred into Liberia, in that sense, it's not a local problem.
Yeah.
But you might say there are further transferences. So, for example, there was the Civil War. The Civil War ended. Women took part in the Civil War in large numbers as combatants. And then what happened? There was a kind of backlash.
Yeah.
You would have thought that norms of femininity would have changed
Yeah.
in view of their participation in the war. Instead, you've got a more rigid form of femininity in the eyes of which those women combatants are now seen as carriers of terror.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit that, you know, the carriers of terror are again a structural position that shifts.
Yeah.
And former combatants have functioned as those carriers of terror after the Civil War.
Yeah.
And with something so slippery and transferable, how do you tackle it? I don't know.
No, that's exactly it. Very well put. But I think that's part of the problem, is I'm saying, yes, we have all of these structural frames, and like, you know, we have the civilized and we have the primitive, and we have, you know, the symbolic blackness and symbolic whiteness, and I'm saying none of it gets us to what we're trying to actually talk about, right? But these are the frames that exist, and these are the frames that people are drawing on. And then also to speak to gender, so the way that the society is divided is that, you know, Indigenous Liberians and American Liberians, and that's passed down intergenerationally, right? So if an Indigenous woman gives birth, her baby is automatically Indigenous, right? Or native, quote unquote, American Liberian. You know, you give birth, and your child is automatically American Liberian, right? And the passing down of cultural status, right? And it functions very much similar to the ways in which, you know, Black women in the context of American slavery passed down slaveness, right? So there is no way out of your native status, right? So you kind of see those logics of slavery and hereditary race or culture, right? And I don't think we can draw a distinction, especially in the Liberian context. You're stuck in that social class, right? There's no way of working your way up unless, and I think this is, so if a Native woman procreates with an American Liberian man, then there is a possibility for that. Versus, you know, we have the one drop rule in the US, but things have to function with the difference in a context where everybody's Black, right? And it's not like, especially because everybody's Black and not everybody's light skinned, right? So in the US, you know, we can talk about how, you know, based on shade, your privilege is different, you navigate the world differently, but in America, in an American Liberian context, when they first moved over, a lot of these American Liberians were of a lighter complexion, but with time, if you're in an all Black context, you can't control the shades of people, so you have to think about, okay, how is white supremacy going to function in a different way, right? But still, its protocols are still there. I don't know if that speaks a little bit, yeah.
There's the idea of the concept of caste as something that travels helpful, not helpful in a further conflict.
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of literature that talks about it. It's this sort of caste system. But for me, I think it doesn't speak to, I think it speaks to race, but it doesn't speak to anti-Blackness. blackness specifically, and I think that's why I'm using the concept of anti-blackness instead of caste, but it is divided like a caste system. But like I said, you know, there's not very many light-skinned people left. So it functions like a caste system, but not.
This was fantastic. Sorry if my question isn't fully formed, it's kind of like a question and a comment at the same time. Thinking about, I guess, the making of Liberia, and thinking about Liberia being one of the few Black republics, right? So coming into being and forming through this detour, through slavery, as predicated on anti-Blackness, right? So there's almost like a political seed that is connected to being human, to being a state, right? That is anti-Black, and building on your response here, that is also rooted in misogynoir, right?
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting sort of, I don't know if I should say an ethnicized sort of inflection of misogynoir that works with broader anti-Blackness in the making of the human and the making of the state, right? Because Liberia emerges as that. So I'm just, sorry, I'm just thinking.
No, but that's exactly it, right? Because the making of the state and the making of the human are co-constitutive, right? So these folks came over and they thought, you know, we're going to prove the fact that we have the capacity to function as free human beings in Liberia, right? Not only do we have the mental capacity, but we have the moral capacity to be free beings. And what does morality look like in a kind of modernity that is so rooted in white Christian theology? It looks like a nuclear family, right? It looks like a Victorian sort of iteration of gender, right? In Black faith. And it looks like as soon as you get there, you build up these churches, right? And these churches and the role of the church and the role of the state becomes, you know, one. So there was another part of your comment, but
I was just thinking about like misogynoir working in all of that and the make,
right?
This peculiar Black state, right?
Right. So part of showing that you have the capacity to be a free human is also building up a good state, right? And a properly functioning state. And by doing that, you're improving your mental capacity for self-sovereignty, but also sovereignty of the country.
Can you explain again how are you using the concept of simulacra and like the politics of spectacle? You touched a lot on that, and I just wanted to hear more.
Sure. So simulacra is a concept that Joy James talks about. I don't know if you're familiar with Joy James, but if you're not, you need to get familiar. But she talks about how none of it is real. So that's how she's using it, like in a philosophical way, right? That, you know, all of this is made up. Not to say that the implications of being a racialized person aren't real, right? But whiteness isn't real, Blackness isn't real, all the degraded humanities in between, right? All of those aren't real, right? They're created, and they stuck. So that's the first part. And then spectacle, I think it's just about the photographs that we see of African conflicts, right? So we see really violent and disturbing photographs of, you know, dead Black bodies, murdered children, that I think applies to Palestine. It applies to Syria, it applies to so many different conflict affected situations that aren't white, right? Because we reserve a certain respect for whiteness and the injured white body, right? That we just don't reserve for other races. So I think that's really the extent to which I draw on spectrum.
Can I, on that actually, because Liberia in terms of that kind of performance of violence or Western media showing, and there was the entire question of the child soldiers that was particularly acute in Liberia and Sierra Leone. So definitely at the end of the 90s, right, from especially 97 to 2003, this was very prevalent. And so there was this incredibly anti-African, I would dare say, discourse at the time. That was also a few years after the Rwanda genocide, etc. So Africa really was kind of holding that place of objection at the time. And I do feel like it has shifted slightly in terms of a sort of redirecting of Western stereotypes of, otherness and barbarity against the kind of Muslim terrorists, given very weirdly almost some sort of breathing space for African representations to sort of become much more complicated. And also in terms of thinking about Africa as connected to its diasporas and therefore re-injecting that sense of, historicity. So I was just wondering about what you think about that. And the other thing is, so Liberia, we can clearly see how it can have this kind of, exceptionalist narrative about, being one of the first Black republics and having that sort of very specific social fabric of this very westernized minority, coastal elite, etc., versus native populations that are then completely dehumanized. I was just wondering if you'd ever looked comparatively across the Atlantic coast, because I mean, I studied Liberia before studying Angola, and it's very interesting the ways in which a lot of the things that are talked about in the context of Liberia actually apply to Angola, which is also a country that has a very exceptionalist narrative about and a very flawed connection to Africanness. And so I was just wondering if that is something that you had looked at a bit transnationally, so looking if, especially on these coastal countries, if that kind of division is replicated elsewhere.
So I think for me, Liberia is just a case in point because it's more obvious, right? Because we have, these, we have American Liberians who directly came from the US, right? So my ability to talk about plantation logics was a little bit easier that way, right? To kind of make that connection explicit. But I think what I'm trying to do is produce a theoretical paradigm that applies to all of West Central Africa. So I think it applies to Rwanda. I think it applies to Sierra Leone. I think it applies to Angola, right? It applies to Congo, because the relations between folks are, because these are all, in the where we get, these ethnic conflicts, right? And these unending wars in Africa, and there's just like inherent proclivity towards just violence that is just ancient and it's just inherent to Africans. And what I'm trying to do is speak back to that. And I think all of those contexts need to be reread through the lens of anti-Blackness, or not even reread, but in conversation with, the idea of indirect rule, right? Because indirect rule only talks about the aftermath of colonialism, right? And I want to talk about the afterlife of slavery, right? Because colonialism doesn't happen without slavery, right? And those logics are continuous, right? And then the second part, the first part, which was the point about Africa being, so are you talking about like post 9/11? You think?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, it's a bit, the whole narrative about how is it in English, but about like the rebirth of Africa. Suddenly there was a lot of media attention against like the rise of Africa, and it kind of suddenly it was very edgy and fancy and
Africa is rising.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, it's because you're talking about IRs, and so these kind of global discourse that are, that seem to be shifting, not overnight, but almost now that a new villain has sort of replaced Africans, that absolute figure of objection of otherness.
Danny has a paper on that, on Darfur, and how the Muslim body becomes the object of the sort of Western hatred ire, as a means of perpetuating this sort of paternalistic relation with Africa. So it's never just evolve. I think what you were talking about, right? Like there's never, it's not this idea that, we have this long arc where eventually we're getting to freedom, right? There's always this sort of displacement and anyway,
No, I know, I was actually gonna question you anyways. But also I think that Cornell, I think it's Cornell West who talks about that post 9/11 moment, instead of as, we turn our attention to brown people, he talks about it as I don't wanna misquote what he says, but he talks about it as like the niggerization of Muslims, right? In a book called wow, I'm blanking on the name of the book.
We'll find
I'll
it.
remember after. It's called The War on Terror, Race, and Sexuality. Yeah, so I don't know if that's what necessarily happens, and I don't know if I can answer your question without giving it more thought. But I think, because it makes me think about, okay, what about like places like Sudan, right? Because we get Islamophobia in Sudan, but we also get anti-Blackness, right? And we also get the perpetuation of anti-Blackness, right? So I'm not sure how that would speak to that. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in and has like some thoughts.
To jump in just a little bit on that and to ask you a question related to that. Because I was thinking, I mean, this talk that you gave, you're talking and you explained like Central Africa, but I was just thinking if this could be applied, if you had any thoughts or like were you thinking, looking into like a broader context, for example, because there are so many things that apply, I mean, from like Black population, but that applies, for example, to other native, like people from other countries. So I don't know, I was just wondering if like, what are your thoughts on that? And if this could be, because I think it could be applied to like other contexts, because there are so many similarities, even though like cannot be like homogenized. But I mean, I was just wondering if you like have thought a little bit about that.
I don't think I think so. I think a lot with Jared Sexton and his idea of degraded humanities, right? So I think we have Blackness and we have whiteness at a structural level, and those in betweens don't happen without these two races. So I think the lens of anti-Blackness. So the Combahee River Collective, they have this quote where they say that, once Black women are free, we'll all be free, right? So I think in the same way that by thinking through the lens of anti-Blackness, I think if we do that, then, we can use that lens to think about a lot of conflict affected nations. We can think about India, for example, India and Pakistan. We can even Latin America, right? I think, we can think about Brazil. I think it applies everywhere, right? Because the idea of the human is, and it's so basic, right? Like they really said copy paste, but that's really what it is, right? So I think it can be applied. I don't think I'm the right person to do work that isn't based in Africa or Black nations, but I do think there's room for that kind of work. Thank you very much.
Just really wanted quickly to add to what was being said earlier about the thought I just had was to not lose sight. I think it was on the whole Africa, the image is kind of improved. So I was just going to say, and I'm so happy you pointed the Combahee River Collective, but just to point to, there's so much work, right? There is so much work that Black people bear and do. Black Africans, Afro descendants, elsewhere, that goes unrecognized, right? And then we just kind of like, things are improving. It's not plucked out of thin air, right? There's a lot of work that goes unrecognized. labor, sweat bodies, right? People losing their lives, their livelihoods, and so on. So I just wanted to.
No, but I
add
think
that.
you're right, and it's like, are things improving, right? Because still, $40 billion comes out of Africa every single year, right? So even the money that is coming out of Africa doesn't compare to the amount that goes out, right? And then also, are we measuring improvement in the terms of racial capitalism, right? How well can Africa do capitalism? Because that system doesn't work, right? We know it doesn't work. And even if we think comparatively between the US and Liberia, the racial wealth gap in the US, we know is huge, right? Even though African people built that country from the ground up, right? And the racial wealth gap in Africa, same thing, but both those gaps are connected, right? So it's like the fact that in the US, you know, Black people don't have a lot of the time. I think there's like, and not to say that being a billionaire is a good thing, but I think for every, it was a significant amount. And, you know, sorry if I'm not remembering the numbers, but the discrepancy between Black billionaires and white billionaires is huge, right? But obviously we also know that the majority of poor folk in the US are Black folks, right? But the reason that the folks at the top, the 1%, have that 1% is because they're exploiting Africa, right? So it's a racial wealth gap that for some reason we talk about in domestic terms, but it's like there would be no capitalism in the States if it wasn't for the plundering of African nations, right? And I don't even think racial wealth gap is a term that we can use in the African context, right? Because people don't even have access to basic necessities a lot of the time, right? So I really don't know what we mean when we say Africa is rising. Yeah, it feels like just neoliberal capitalist bullshit to me.
Yeah, no, it's very fancy, exoticizing
Yeah.
media discourse, but I mean, at some point it was everywhere, like it was so trendy, and it's interesting in terms of
How the discourse has changed.
yeah, and but also what is it translating in terms of very concrete, IR policies, global policies, enacting violence on bodies and nations, etc. I mean, it's not because not only is it not coming out of thin air because of the work you described, but also because it is the product of state efforts to destroy certain nations more than others, or to so it's also these kind of connections that also Liberia stands for, because in the late 90s and we hear much less about Liberia, but it became this kind of poster nation for everything that was wrong about post-colonial Africa in ways that were, I mean, there was like an entire aesthetic of it. So the shifting aesthetic is, I mean, is something that I find troubling.
Yeah, no, I agree. I do think it's being talked about differently, but there's this reading called Slavery Perfecting Itself. And I'm wondering if that would apply in terms of, I think, how power generally perfects itself. Is it, it listens to us on the ground, it listens to people protesting, it listens to what we were describing as problematic, and it eats it up and then it spits it back out, right? In a way that kind of gets people to forget about the problem, even though it doesn't, right? But bear with me here. So I think what it does is it eats up our critical work, right? And it eats up the work of activists to say, here, we've addressed this, but really it's like we've obscured it even more so that you can't draw it out. And I think that's part of it, right?
Yeah.
So
I think that's very true. Anyone know better?
Can you talk a little bit more about how you use social contract theory? Because I get reminded of one interview that a Black activist did at the height of the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, Kimberly Jones, and she, in the video, she's like saying a lot of things. It's a very long video. One of the things she mentions is that the social contract is broken. And I think, for example, the social contract theory kind of has implications about consent. There are like consent as a concept is like very flawed in feminist theory. And so I just wanted to know how you implement that.
Okay, so I think for me, I'm drawing on social contract theory, specifically in relation to the way that Black political theorists talk about it as a racial contract rather than a social contract, right? But I think part of what it means to be in a social contract with the state is that, you know, you do your ultimate citizenship work, right? And you get the protection of the state, you know, the right to vote. So it's essentially literally a contract between the citizen, the state and its subjects, right? But I think that social contract theory can actually be used to talk about desirability, right? Because you have to be a certain kind of subject to be recognized as entitled, right? To those rights, right? That are promised to you under citizenship, right? So if you don't perform your subjectivity in a particular way, then you don't have access to certain things, right? And obviously in Liberia, that's like being indigenous, right? Indigenous people weren't incorporated into the body subject until the late 19th century. Before that, they were just not part of the state, right? And even if we think about take it back way back to the 14th century and talk about when the Spanish were in Liberia and they said, okay, we need to form a nation state, but the first thing we need to do is, you know, the first order of business is getting rid of Moors, which were Black Ethiopians and the Jews, right? And then we can finally have, you know, a polity that we feel like we can give their entitled rights to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just to make sure I understood, so proximity to symbolic whiteness, which is a position which might be filled differently in different contexts, translates into preservability.
Yeah, I think. Yeah.
I have a question, but I've asked 10 questions, so I'm very, very happy. So it's something that I wonder about with Afro-pessimism generally, because some authors are mention it and others less, and it's how do you work class within narratives of anti-Blackness? Because I mean, I think the case for a structural anti-Blackness and legacies of slavery as, you know, pervading our narratives and understandings of the UN extremely convincing. And I struggle then with the question of class and again, I guess the question of, you know, upper social classes in relation to whiteness or aspiring to whiteness, and how do we, because in a country like Liberia, class is also extremely important in maintaining those differences, right? In maintaining these kinds of cultural capital and transmitting it, and I mean it comes with cash, right? To sort of maintain that kind of status, to cultivate that difference, and that kind of financial privilege comes with a better connection to capital forces, right? Or maybe not, maybe you have a different reading of it. And I was just wondering how you sort of, if at all, how class comes into play in thinking about how these social divisions are violently enforced transnationally and at the local level.
I guess my question, I have a question back for you, is to what extent is class going to change the questions that I put forth, right? So I do think that, you know, when we're talking about the Black intelligentsia, we're talking about, you know, Marcus Garvey, and Alexander Mo, we're all talking about, so these are the leaders of the Back to Africa movement. We're talking about a particular class of African American folks who were freeborn, and they were better off than their former enslaved counterparts, conflicts, right? And this shows up in Liberia where, formerly enslaved people who go to Liberia, they go without access to capital, right? And their idea of doing well is connected to, so they said there is a family with family. So Peyton Skipwith and his family go to Liberia in 1833. And they're disappointed. They're disillusioned with how things turn out for them. They're not doing well financially. And in the archives, there's a letter that Peyton Skipwith writes back to his former master in the US where he says, all the well-off people have slaves, right? And when he's talking about slaves, they have indigenous people working for them, right? So his concept of being well-off is so tied to either, so if you are well-off, you own human property, right? So I think what Afro-pessimism is trying to do is to get us away, and not necessarily away, but I think we spend so much time talking about the profit, and so the cost benefit analysis of transatlantic slavery, right? That there's research, and particularly this is in Eric Williams' work where he talks about how it actually would have been cheaper to just enslave other Europeans. So let's actually talk about the symbolic value of slavery, right? And I think that's what Afro-pessimism is trying to get us at. Class is always relevant, right? But I think what we're not talking about is how Blackness is always relevant as well. And I think that's what I'm trying to do rather than spend time talking about class division. Of course, class gets you closer to whiteness, right? And it's like all of these different facets of, the normative subject. The normative subject is productive and the productive subject produces capital, right? But I think my focus is particularly on how to embody normativity.
Thanks. Still have 5 minutes, so if there's.
Yeah.
Oh my god, I forgot we were all.
I was like, it's Jeremy checking the Q&A and I wasn't checking if everyone had their.
Yeah, love that they raised it.
Yeah, someone raise their hand. Okay, so I'll allow you to talk. Hi, can you hear us?
Yes, please. Am I audible?
Barely.
Can you talk a little bit?
Am I audible?
You can ask. Because they raised their hand.
Yeah, no, please, we're listening.
Am I audible? Yes, please. I have a question.
Write it down.
Maybe.
Can you talk again?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have discussed in detail about anti-black ontologies. If I reframe this, how would you address the issue of anti-Asian ontologies?
Is that the question? I guess it's not really my, it's not, I'm particularly focused on anti-Blackness, but I do think there's room for people to talk about anti-Asianness, but just, I don't think it's specifically relevant to the work that I am doing, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on how you see it speaking to anti-Asianness or my work specifically, or just say more about the question so that I can engage with you.
Yes, please. Am I audible, please?
Very much so.
Yes, yes. Myself, Dr. Vipin Pal Singh, and I am Associate Professor of English at Central University of Punjab. First of all, I would like to congratulate you for this wonderful talk.
Thanks.
My question is that if I reframe the issue instead of the black ontologies, if I ask you, how will you address the issue of anti-Asian ontologies?
Yeah, I think ontology can be used as a framework to talk about different contexts. But I'm not sure that I'm the right person to speak to that. Does anyone want to comment on that? That might be better equipped.
I was just gonna say I think you answered it previously by saying that addressing anti-Black ontologies opens this way, right, to talk about many other forms of oppression.
Yeah. And I guess like I think caste can be read through ontology, right? And I think caste can be read through anti-Blackness. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a more comprehensive answer for you.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, Lilis,
Yes,
final question.
Okay. I know this is a big question and I'm not expecting like, oh, this is what we should do. But I was gonna, like, my head is going in circles in terms of international relations as a field. Because, and again, I'm not from international relations, so I might be mistaken on that, but if the field of international relations is interested in nation states, and you're stating that the nation states is creating human according to a certain structure of anti-Blackness, or anti-Blackness being the fundamental structure for the construction of humans in this nation state, then how can you do international relations? How can you do research in the field and write liberatory praxis or like theory that actually serves us in changing this world? And I'm saying that because no, yeah, I'm gonna stop there. Does that make sense? Like,
That makes a lot of sense.
I guess, how do you feel being
Yeah.
in international relations and writing about this?
So I'm actually gender studies all the way. But I am writing against international relations. I don't think you can write anything liberatory from within the discipline, right? Using its work because it was invented to justify colonialism, right? How do we do colonialism better, right? So I'm not really sure how you can write anything from within it that's going to be revolutionary. I think we can make things better, survivable, more habitable, right? And it's the same way that, when we do EDI, right? How can we live in this shitty system as it is, right? But I don't think there's any theoretical futurity in the discipline. And I think it draws so much on anthropology, which we know is like the root of all evil, in terms of how like anthropology invented these degraded humanities, right?
Then history as well, right?
Yeah.
Just don't want to leave any.
Yeah. All of them. I think they all need to go. So yeah. Yeah.
I'm gonna continue on that, just to follow up. I feel like history and anthropology have tried, even though we can agree that it can never fully live to like a true liberatory potential. I feel like there are discussions in the field of history and anthropology that have tried to sort of come up with new theoretical ways of understanding things. Is that also the case in international relations?
I think it's like, there's, like they've all kind of tried that. I think, and Lynn, maybe you want to help me out here, but I think everything that has come out of, critical security studies, critical anthropologies, right? I think we're still drawing on the same theoretical tools that we were always drawing on, right? I'm sure the work is, I think 100% of the work is better, right? But I don't think it really moves us forward. And I think specifically in the context of IR, we have all this, new literature on, we should do, ethnic power sharing, right? Or this is how Africa should do politics, right? Or this is how basically all conflict affected places should do politics, and this is how we're gonna solve the problem of war, and they haven't. Right, and we have like for 100 years, right?
Yeah, I'm just gonna add to that, people like Chilean are trying.
Yeah.
Right, and then Livia, I forget her last name, the other C is also, Ruba, I mean, I'm just sorry, there are people trying, right, but you're right, they are drawing a lot on, Black geography is a big contributor as well.
Yeah.
Being plundered, I don't know which way it goes.
Yeah.
There are attempts, but IR is, I mean, I myself am supposed to be an IR. I say I'm in international politics.
Yeah.
Because like IR is fraud, like it's structurally.
It is, but we also have like someone like Morgan Costa here, who's doing her for an IR, where she's retelling the story of the emergence of the international system from plantationism.
Right.
And so I think that like she was really good, she was really good work.
Yeah.
That's like geography right there. Though.
Yeah, right, but that's what I'm saying, like, I'm in conversation with these people, right, that are trying to do more critical work, that in terms of thinking about just like people who are doing straight up IR and thinking, yeah, it's gonna work this time, like, that doesn't make sense to me.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks for your questions.
Thank you.
I agree.